5% on loans every year with no telling when they'd be repaid, then the cost of this program would quickly get out of control. So if the Johnson administration wanted to make higher education universally accessible, they had to find another way to fund it.
Lyndon Johnson said, aha, I have an idea. We can help students get loans without it being on the federal government's books. Let's just somehow persuade banks to make loans to students.
Maybe this plan would convince opponents in Congress, but the banks were definitely not on board. This is because at the time, the conventional wisdom was that student loans were risky.
Because you didn't quite know, which students would end up staying for 4 years. You didn't know what field they were going to go into. Were they going to be a doctor? Were they going to be something else that didn't pay nearly as much? And so, there was just a lot of uncertainty that banks were really reluctant to get involved in this.
They were afraid of federal overreach, and they fought it. Johnson himself actually got involved in the negotiations with the leaders of the American Bankers Association to stop their opposition.
Johnson was known as a very persuasive dealmaker, but his patriotic pitch was not enough. Johnson had to offer the banks something more, something tangible.
To convince banks to do this, they came up with what was called the Guaranteed Loan Program. The government basically co-signed. The government played the role of co-signer and basically said, if you give this student a loan and that student fails to repay, ultimately we will make you whole. So guess what? You're not taking on that much risk because ultimately the government's going to step in and pay you back.
This was a deal the banks couldn't really refuse. It meant that they would get a steady stream of business and it would be backed by the U.S. government. So if a student couldn't pay back a loan, no problem. The U.S. government would make sure the banks didn't lose out on the loans or the interest they would make. A pretty sweet deal that Johnson had to offer in order to get the banks on board.
And so banks started to make loans under this program.
But there was another problem.
College costs had gone up 90% since 1950. And 4 years of college averaged about $7,000 a year at the time. That seems cheap. I know it seems cheap, but American families made less than $5,600 when college costs on average are $7,000 a year. And that's the key thing. I know it seems cheap, but it really wasn't at the time.
And remember, these loans were guaranteed by government dollars, taxpayer dollars. Josh Mitchell says the Johnson administration assumed that the program wouldn't cost taxpayers anything because everyone would repay their loans.
These students are going to go to college, they're going to come out with this great education, and they're going to get great jobs, and the government won't even have to come back and pay you. This is all going to work out just fine. They didn't really consider just how big this program was going to get, and that there would actually be a lot of people who might drop out. They really put on rose-colored glasses here and thought that everything would be a win-win.
It was here, these surroundings, that I first understood the deeper meaning of the Bible's promise, that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
The Higher Education Act was passed and signed into law on November 8, 1965. For President Lyndon Johnson, it was an important personal victory.
When he went to sign the bill, there was a ceremony at Southwest Texas State Teachers College, his alma mater, where he signed it at a desk in the gymnasium with the crowd there looking on, and he basically said, now the pathway is open for people to go to college.
Here the seeds were planted, from which grew my firm conviction that for the individual, education is the path to achievement and fulfillment. And for the nation, it is a path to society that is not only free but civilized.
And it was around this point that he told Congress as part of an education message that college is no longer a choice, it's now a necessity. So I really think he was like the first president to say college was not just for the highest achievers, that it was actually for just about anyone.
The Higher Education Act was passed just as baby boomers started arriving on campus. College attendance shot up, but so did inflation.
Food costs are very much increased.
Inflation starts to happen.
I'm a consumer, and I think my wife just went out and bought me some shirts the other day, and I can't believe what they cost.
Basically, the cost of living was rising in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s.
How much has the price of coal increased in the last year?
Oh, approximately 35–40%.
One hidden cost is to our sense of freedom. Even our freedom to dream. Our normal expectations of getting ahead are being reduced to hopes of holding on.
At this time, some banks wouldn't lend to students because the interest rate was lower than the borrowing costs, so they'd lose money on the loans. Congress raised the student loan interest rate to 10%.
By the 70s, Americans are in the tricky situation that they can't afford college and they can't afford not to go to college. You have to be able to compete for that work because in the 70s, those blue-collar jobs, those manufacturing jobs, they're disappearing.
There were higher prices, higher unemployment, and a need to go to college to compete in the job market. On top of that, many people who'd taken out guaranteed student loans under the Higher Education Act simply couldn't pay them back. And a new president, Richard Nixon, walked into this economic situation. People were pissed.
We have Americans writing to their elected representatives, talking about the pain, talking about how they can't afford to stay in school, they can't afford to send their kid, they just can't afford it.
So this really quickly became a mess. There were some people in the new Nixon administration that were saying, wait a minute, why are we relying on banks? Let's just have the federal government do this. Even if it is a hit to the federal budget, let's just have the Treasury Department make loans. And there was this guy who used to be a lobbyist for the banks, who was now one of the top Treasury Department officials in the Nixon administration, who said, no, the federal government does not have the ability to handle a loan program. The government does not know how to run things like a private sector bank does. It would just be an even bigger mess. It would be inept. Here's what we need to do. We need to create this new entity, and we'll call it Sallie Mae.
Sallie Mae, a name that's probably familiar to many of you, was established in 1973.
Sallie Mae is what they call a quasi-public agency where it's overseen by the federal government, but it's actually a for-profit company. Now, here's the key. Guess who owns Sallie Mae? Because I mentioned that even though their board was, in part appointed by Congress and the White House, its owners, its shareholders were banks and schools.
Shareholders, which meant banks and schools had a vested interest in students borrowing as much money as possible. So the federal government, banks, and universities all form this organization. And what they decide is,
what we're going to do is we're going to have the Treasury Department in this really opaque way funnel money to Sallie Mae, and then Sallie Mae in this opaque way is going to funnel money to the banks. Now, if that sounds complicated, it's because it is.
Basically, Sallie Mae played the role of a middleman, administering student loans from banks that are guaranteed by the government. And it ended up being very good for banks and private partners.
Sallie Mae created a gold mine because you can buy and sell this student debt. It comes with a government guarantee in the 70s when the economy isn't doing so well. If you're a lender and you're experimenting with these student loans that you're guaranteed repayment on, you'll start experimenting with what we call private loans.
Private student loans were basically used by students and their parents to cover anything the government-backed student loans and grants couldn't. So let's say you're a student who has reached the maximum loans you can take out and still need a few $1,000s more to fully pay your room and board. Well, a bank participating in the federal loan program, likely buying and selling debt through Sallie Mae, is also there to sell you a private bank loan. That loan is not backed by the government. And what that allows is the bank to essentially set the interest rate for private loans.